affectionately been calling it. It should be a very interesting discussion today. We've got a theology professor, a philosophy professor, and two students one of psychology and biology. So hopefully they'll be able to give us an interesting perspective on the topic of death today. Dr. Marshall, if you'd like to start and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do here at Aquinas.
Well, I want to thank the Philosophy Club first off for inviting me to sit on my first death panel. I hope there are many more, and I hope I can exercise any choice that would take another person's life. But I really appreciate the fact because when I was an undergraduate, I was a philosophy major, and to me, to gather together in these types of situations is precisely what college folks ought to do, is to wrestle with these kind of questions. As a theology professor here for the last 15 years, I teach things as the God course and marriage and world religions and a ton of other things, Thomas Aquinas and Augustine among others.
I'm Amy Patillo, and can you hear like this? Can you hear me very well? I'm an adjunct professor of philosophy here, and I am not an expert on death, but I was corralled into doing this, and so I've got a few things that I can say just from the history of philosophy, that kind of thing. But otherwise, I'm interested particularly in language and in art, philosophy of language and philosophy of art.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Vanden Halbert. I'm a psychology and philosophy double major here at Aquinas. I'm a senior. I want to second the words of thanks to the Philosophy Club, which is a little selfish because I'm a member of the Philosophy Club, but thanks to Nate and everyone for organizing this. I am filling in for Dr. Victor Karandachev, who was supposed to be here, but unfortunately had an emergency come up. So I'm going to do my best to represent the discipline of psychology on this particular topic. So thank you very much.
My name is St. John Schoenfield. I'm representing the biological field. I'm a biology and French major here at Aquinas. I'm not representing a particular professor we had lined up because they were all busy. So I'm by no means an expert, but like Jonathan, I'll do the best I can to answer the questions given. And thank you to Nate as well.
All right, thank you guys. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have a few questions that we have lined up. Each panelist will have 3 minutes to answer the questions, and then we'll have 2 minutes afterwards for the other panelists to respond to what they've said. After that, of course, we'll have Q&A from the audience. So if you guys think of any questions, be sure to keep those in mind for the end of the session. So this first question is, what is death as defined in your field, and what are its implications in your fields? Dr. Marshall, if you'd like to start us off.
Well, death in theology is the end of biological life, simply. And the implications for that is that it's not the end of life altogether, because in theology we believe that the human beings are body-soul composites, and their soul is both immaterial and immortal, so that life continues on beyond this life that is experienced through bodily death. And bodily death is the means by which we enter into eternal life, which can be either a beatific vision, in which we participate in the supernatural life of God, or hell, which would mean that we participate in a life apart from God in some sense, which would be a type of spiritual death. So in theology, the end of bodily life is an entrance into an eternal life of some sort, which can be either positive or negative.
Are there any responses? Go ahead. Professor Patillo?
Well, one thing to say is it should be that the members of the Philosophy Club don't find this topic especially important, since according to Plato, any philosopher worth their salt is half dead already. And that, I think, kind of points the direction of the question within philosophy, is that it's, at least nowadays especially, it's much more of a moral question than a metaphysical question or an ontological question, a question about, is there life after death? Can consciousness continue without a body? That's been farmed out pretty, I would say, to the natural sciences, to psychology and to biology. And then as far as the a priori, the possibility of establishing life, the immortality of the soul or the self by a priori principles or principles that have necessity, that I think is something that possibly within theology it's considered something that can still be done. But within philosophy, since Kant really put that beyond philosophy's ken by suggesting that the arguments that used to be made in terms of the simplicity of the soul or the substantiality of the soul or the self, that those come from a transcendental perspective, something that is beyond what we can reason about, because it's part of the terms of our reason. We can't get a perspective on it because it's necessary for any perspective that we have. And so he's kind of pushed that out of bounds. And then one other thing I want to say about how it's out of bounds for philosophy is that Hume made a more pressing problem about the self in terms of what is the living self? Is there such a thing as a living self, let alone a self that might continue after we die? The idea that there is such an entity as a self that we can put our finger on is something that Hume called into question. And so that whole question of the self's coherence after death, well, we're not even going to start answering that if we haven't even figured out whether the self has any existence while we're still alive. So I think I've run over, because as far as the moral, then the question of, I guess I'll just say one other thing. So the idea of what it is in philosophy, why it's a moral question, the moral question would be then, what's the implication for how we live our lives? What's the implication of the fact that our lives might be finite on the life that we live? That, I think, is more what philosophy continues to treat. What do we do about this life? What do we do in this life, given that it's finite, given that it if you believe that's the case.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Kant right toward the very end, because obviously Immanuel Kant had a phenomenal influence, no pun intended, phenomenal influence on psychology as a growing discipline, by sort of redirecting a lot of the focus of things to the structures of the mind and how the mind organizes things. So I think that's sort of a good segue into what psychology has to say about death. There's one thing I'll say really briefly first. Most psychologists, I think, would say that psychology is what's called a pre-paradigmatic science. So you have many different schools of thought in psychology, and not all of them agree with each other. This is to be contrasted with biology, probably I'd say, where you have pretty mainstream beliefs that are consistent throughout, every member of the discipline. Most people agree on certain things. In psychology, however, you have people in a behaviorist tradition, you have existential psychologists, you have cognitive psychologists, functionalists, you have many different schools of thought. Many of them disagree with one another. So the thing I just wanted to start by saying is that I'm going to be speaking mostly from a behavioral psychological perspective. And that has mostly to do with the stimulus response sort of model. So it's very, very biological at base. So St. John and I will probably have a lot of overlap here, but yeah. So this is all I can say really about what death is defined as. Obviously, to an extent, I'm going to avoid any sort of metaphysical speculation about death, since that's far outside the purview of psychology. For the most part, I think psychologists, however, in any school of thought, would agree with the biological definition of death. So it sounds like, for the most part, we're sort of all on the same page on that issue. It's what comes after. That's probably the interesting question. Besides that, though, another relevant thing to bring up is how death is perceived, because that's obviously going to be a very important thing in psychology. I think one good way of looking at it is, no matter what the phenomenon of death is in itself, there are going to be many different perceptions of what death is and how human beings respond to death in circumstances of dying, the grieving process, and everything like that. So while it's important, I think, as I'm going to say scientists or as people seeking the truth in general, to try and ask the question what death is and to try and figure out what it actually is in reality. An important component in psychology is the idea of recognizing what different people think death is and helping them along in the process of coping with death. So for instance, for a religious person, if you're in a clinical field, you may want to, again, sort of set aside any judgment of their religious beliefs, and I would think for the most part sort of accept what their beliefs are and kind of help them cope with the circumstance of death and dying within whatever worldview sort of works best for them. And those circumstances would be different for different people, but yeah, that's all I really have to say. So.
All right, well, I think this was touched on a little bit by everybody else who's already spoken, but biologically speaking, death is the cessation of those characteristics that are endemic to life. So it's a descriptive term in biology because our understanding of it is far from perfect. And so generally what it takes for an organism to be considered alive is that it engages in certain things such as homeostasis. Its cells have to be organized, it has to have metabolism, it has to grow, it has to be able to adapt over time and respond to stimuli, and it has to reproduce. So the end of those biological functions, or the end of most of them, is generally what's considered to be biological death. Again, I'll just reiterate what Jacob was saying. This biological science doesn't have anything to say about what happens after, because it's concerned primarily, well, entirely, with just the material of the body and the biological organism. Death can, or life can alternatively be thought of, rather than just those processes, in these terms that were suggested by Schrodinger, the famous physicist. He considered living organisms to be systems which were capable of negative entropy, meaning that entropy, in layman's terms, is just the using up of useful energy in a system. So the universe is a system, Earth is a system, the body is a system. But living organisms are capable of drawing energy from their surroundings, so increasing the entropy around them in order to keep it low in their own body. So they build up their own energy by taking it from the environment. So either from the sun, in terms of autotrophs, or in terms of consumption of other organic matter. So death could be thought of as kind of a final overcoming of that negative entropy by an otherwise all-pervading entropy in the universe. So eventually entropy does increase, even in these systems which are capable of negating it for a time. And the implications of death in biological terms are massive, because death, along with time, is the primary driving force of evolution. We see from the fossil record, very early in Earth's history, there were few organisms not few, there were multitudes of organisms, but there wasn't much variety until we see the introduction of predation. And so we see much more death through violent means after what's called the Cambrian explosion, when, well, actually the Cambrian explosion is caused by the introduction of predation. But once there are different ways for organisms to die, there are different ways for them to adapt. And so it leads to massive amounts of variety in the biological chain of life. But it also eliminates that variety because 99% of the species which have existed on Earth are now extinct. So it both provides for variety and then eliminates it. I guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you. All right. Go right ahead. Yes.
So I think that one thing that probably weighs on a lot of people's minds is that there's an intuitive, I think, conflict for a lot of people between a theological perspective on death and a biological or scientific perspective on death. And I was wondering if maybe we could sort of all comment, or you two in particular, Dr. Marshall and St. John, could comment on whether you think that when it comes to death, that conflict really does exist in any sort of substantive way, or if, like St. John said, it's outside the realm of one of his disciplines.
Maybe we can turn it off and turn it back on.
Yeah, so if either of you could comment maybe on that conflict, or if you think there actually is a conflict.
Just before we do that, could you just clarify your point a little bit? Like
So I guess the main sort of conflict arises when you mentioned that biology focuses on the material sort of substance of the body, and therefore doesn't have much to say about sort of like metaphysical views of death or what happens after death and things like that. And Dr. Marshall, you mentioned that theology, you study the human being as a body, soul composite. So obviously right off the bat, it doesn't seem like there's conflict necessarily in those viewpoints, but there is a substantial difference, and I think it's sort of a common belief among lay people especially that, to put it crudely, science and religion are always in conflict. There's something like a sort of incommensurable, I guess, between them. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that, if you think there's any sort of common ground between the two fields, or if you think it's sort of totally off limits to biology to talk about the afterlife and death and things like that, or if you think it's important to
Well, I guess I would say it might appear at first that science and religious belief might be in conflict, but I think more sophisticated points of view realize that religious viewpoints deal with an entirely different realm of human experience than the sciences do. And in fact, religious systems have supported scientific causes, and I think the science versus religion thing is kind of a crude idea. I think that it's not non-existent, because obviously certain ideas in biological science, like the idea that a person is composed solely of just the biological material in their body, that does seem to present problems to a religious mindset. But I think there are many philosophical and theological models that account for that, and account for the idea of a soul existing in spite of what otherwise would be proof that it doesn't exist. I won't go into those because I'm certainly no expert in them, but I also think that certain ideas in biology are problematic to more simplistic views in religion. Obviously, the main one is evolution. A lot of, obviously in southern United States or even in other places, school boards don't want evolution taught because they find it problematic for their viewpoints in a religious mindset. But I think that even those problems can be resolved, and I don't think that there is a fundamental conflict. I think, strictly speaking, biology just deals with a certain area, and it's best if that we leave the other things to theology and philosophy, because it's just not the domain of biology, and it's not our responsibility to deal with those things.
I would agree with been said so far that there's no substantial conflict between a theological view of the world and the human being and the sciences. The conflict has been, I should say, commonly articulated as a result of prejudices within the Enlightenment that because of the success of the sciences see it as the sole means of truth, and everything that does not fall within those methodological principles of empirical investigation do in fact exclude any possibility of dealing with immateriality. And the reason for that is that science itself studies, whether it's psychology or biology or chemistry, studies the relationship between physical members of the world and their weights, their measures, their attractions and repulsions and so on and so forth. And one does not have to study those things with any kind of assumption that there is a spiritual dimension to existence. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm glad you brought up Kant, even his distinction between phenomena and noumena, he says that we can't access noumena. The only thing that we can know is phenomena. And so he narrows the vision of what we can know with regard to the truth of existence that eliminates metaphysics. It also eliminates a theological interpretation and understanding of the world. So the problem is in certain philosophies and certain attitudes, so it seems to me, set up this false conflict, which is not necessary at all.
Thank you very much. Our next question was one that was raised in Philosophy Club that we thought might be pretty interesting. And that is, what are the implications of longer existence or possible immortality via medical technology?
I think we would all commit suicide from despair. Now to your attention, this is one of my favorite questions. This is an interesting question to me, because with the unlocking of the genetic code, while there had been dreams perhaps of possible medical immortality before that, the unlocking of the genetic code, scientifically speaking, really opens up the possibility of medical immortality. Because we might be able, especially with stem cell research that has been going on, it looks like that there's a great possibility, and with confidence, that we will be able to do such things as repair organs that are irreparable, like hearts and livers and so on and so forth. I mean, we are not far from seeing that kind of scientific advancement. And in many respects, I think it's a good thing, but in other respects, I find it particularly problematic. For instance, I would say from a theological standpoint that the desire for medical immortality is a kind of deformed transcendence. That is to say that we would seek to find full and final satisfaction in this life, knowing full well from a common sense perspective that there's nothing in this life that satisfies us. In order to accomplish that then, in order to accomplish medical immortality, we would, in a certain sense, have to cannibalize, and I mean that sincerely, cannibalize the living for their parts. And we do this to a certain degree already, and this is why I find it to be interesting and also problematic. So, for example, in the beginnings of embryonic stem cell research, there's the actual killing of the human being in order to achieve a result of an enhanced life for somebody who's already living. And even beside that, we have this particular problem of black markets for organs in which people simply disappear and their organs are harvested for those who are capable of affording organ transplants and so on and so forth. In looking at those kind of things, it makes me wonder if there's not a link between our fascination with zombies and zombie apocalypses and things of the desire for medical immortality. Because in a real sense then, we living actually have to destroy the life of the living in order to continue to live. And then finally, what I also find interesting, it seems to me, is this aspect that even though we're nowhere near achieving medical immortality, philosophers are already contemplating that it's okay to commit suicide once we've lived 200 or 300 years. Why is that? Because like coalesce, I think we would discover at the end of that time that there's nothing new under the sun, and if there's nothing beyond this life to live for, then there's no sense in maintaining our existence, even after all the trouble we've gone to in order to maintain it for 200 or 300 years. I think Anne Rice dealt with that with vampires in books of hers.
That's all right.
The one thing that it brings to mind to me is, I guess I would agree, not necessarily with the suicide thing, but let's say if we just were living longer, I could imagine it including, bringing with it more violence. And at least if it's true that we have a death wish, and I wonder if we have a death wish, and I think it's worth considering the question that the club's offered for that reason. And so again, I'm kind of trying to say, what does this consideration of death tell us about what it's like to live? And the question of, is the idea that you're going to die an important thing in living? And specifically, do we have an urge for it? And you know how sex and death are often equated in some ways, definitely in literature. This is something that's being somehow suggested that these have to do with each other in some way. Do we have a desire to be obliterated? Is that part of what the sexual desire is? There's ways that you can construe it that way. And so then this idea of, if somehow we were capable of keeping ourselves alive, would that somehow go against these main urges that we have, that we actually have an urge to die?
Okay, well, I have a couple of comments here. The first thing I'll say, again, working from a few different perspectives within psychology, Professor Patel, you mentioned the idea of a death sort of impulse in human beings. A very popular notion that actually developed back in the 40s starts. A very popular notion that developed in Freudian psychoanalysis, actually toward the end of Freud's life, was the idea of what was called a thanatic drive or a death drive. And that was to be contrasted with his sort of ideas of the life instincts. So he focused for a long time on the life instincts, so sort of a redirection of libidinal energy, towards sex and procreation and all that stuff. But after the onset of, I think it was World War I, after seeing that much bloodshed, he did sort of add that additional component. Did believe that that was a realistic drive that human beings had. Having said that, I think there's a better reason than Freud's sort of speculations as to why we might accept the idea that human beings have a need or a drive to die. And I think it's relevant to the question because I don't know for sure if we would be able to psychologically cope with the idea of immortality, we'll just call it functional immortality, living thousands of years. Again, functional stuff. There are a few things. So, and St. John actually might be able to comment on this a little bit more than I can. But from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, which is a very popular sort of sub-discipline in psychology, you obviously have this belief that different emotional responses and different cognitive responses are based on sort of ancient, ingrained environmental pressures, right? So a very common one, a universal one, is that most human beings in every culture that we've so far found, for instance, have a fear of snakes. That's one example, okay? And that's, again, presumably based on a sort of ancient, ingrained fear that arose in our evolutionary history. I see no reason that couldn't be extended to death. I think there's obviously something strongly anti-survival about death. It's something that a fit organism would want to avoid at all costs. So it would make sense that we have these very complex psychological mechanisms that would be developed over time in response to the phenomenon of death. Obviously this is going to get a little contentious, but with all due respect, I would say religion is probably one of these sort of evolutionary coping mechanisms. Of course, that's what Freud believed. He thought that religion, for instance, was a neuroses. I don't necessarily agree with Freud. That sort of makes religion seem more irrational than I think it is. But there are a variety of ways of responding to death, and I think that if we were to try for immortality, which I do personally believe is a good thing, I think that it's proper to view aging and death as pathologies to some extent. But if we did try to pursue this, we would need to drastically reform our sort of psychological ways of viewing ourselves in order to cope with that. Otherwise, to an extent, I actually would agree with your introductory joke. I think despair would be a very likely possibility. Boredom and suicide, probably to some extent. Yeah, that's all I have to say, and that's all I've asked to say.
I have a few points on this topic. First, I would, the first thing I'd like to speak about is the implication in that human beings as biological organisms are not immune from the other things that other animals are affected by. We're completely affected by we're affected by our environment, and it limits our population. It limits how long we can live. It limits everything based on how many resources we consume and how many resources there are in the environment. And I think we might have kind of forgotten that, because so far every environment has a carrying capacity. It has a base amount of resources that can be consumed, that are available for those that consume it. And when an organism or when a species population rises above that carrying capacity, obviously they run out of resources and they're forced back to equilibrium with it, because obviously individuals starve to death or they kill each other over resources. And so far human beings have been pushing our carrying capacity because of our intellect, so we're able to evade that for right now. But I think the truth of the matter is that we live on a planet of finite resources. And even given like science fiction speculation, like getting off of Earth, going and colonizing other planets, even if those things were possible, the universe itself is finite by most scientific models. So the resources in the universe are finite, and if human beings do not age, but they keep creating new human beings, then they'll spread. Obviously, the rate will increase exponentially of how many people there are. And right now, there are 150,000 deaths in the world every day, and 2/3 of those are the result of indirectly of senescence, which is just aging. Obviously, as organisms age, they become more susceptible to disease and other problems. Their cells don't divide properly. It's much easier for them to die, obviously, as they get older. And so 2/3 of the deaths in the human population are a result of that, indirectly. Because you don't die of aging, you die of a direct cause that is indirectly caused by aging. But in industrialized countries, the rate of deaths, or the amount of people who die due to age-related problems, is 90%. And so if every country were like that, or if we increased it so that we didn't age at all and we didn't have those problems, 90% of the deaths in industrialized countries and 2/3 of the deaths that occur in other places wouldn't occur every day. And although it sounds very callous to speak in these terms, if people were not dying naturally that way, they would be dying in other ways, either, again, by surpassing the carrying capacity and starving to death, or just murdering each other for resources. But the other thing I want to say about it is that the drive to live forever, and this isn't speaking strictly biologically, but the idea that an individual should live forever seems in some ways in conflict with the idea of posterity and the idea of surviving through offspring. Because obviously if you're surviving, your offspring are going to have to compete with you for resources. And I think that in a sense it's good for us to get out of our children's way and to make room for the future, and to recognize that we're not we're not perfected beings, and we're not the final form that should exist. Not even to say that there is such a thing, but just to recognize that the future maybe shouldn't always belong to us. And I think it's a little poetic that aging. There are many theories that aging is a result of the organisms evolutionary organisms evolving to avoid cancer. your cells stop dividing properly at a certain age, or they start to stop, in order to prevent cancer in the organism, because obviously if they're replicating too much, that's the cause of cancer. But I think it's kind of a good metaphor for us refusing to age and to die, us just not getting out of the way for other things. It's kind of a cancer that would envelop our society, like people just overwhelming everything and there just being too much, and it just being an unnatural growth that can't be stopped. But on the other hand, actually, I'll talk about this later because I feel like I've run way over time.
Perfectly fine. So a few of you brought up the topic of suicide, and our next question was actually, can suicide be justified morally or rationally? I should go first.
Well, I would think that you can rationalize anything that you would like and then justify it in some sense, but that doesn't mean whether it would be right or the wrong thing to do. And so then, theologically, it would be the case that there's no time that one could rationalize or justify rightly the taking of one's own life. And the reasons for this are many. I mean, first off is that our life is a gift that is bestowed on us, and so it's not ours to dispose of as we will. And in that particular respect, then, we are not given the power, or we do not have the power of life or death over ourselves. And since we do not exercise that power of life or death over ourselves, then we rightly ought not to exercise that power over other people. And therefore, I would think that, I don't know if I agree that we human beings have a death wish, but in a certain sense, if we do have a death wish, then Christianity would seem to me to put the kibosh on that, or at least diminish it severely with respect to the way that it values the life of the human being, and seeks to both promote and preserve the dignity of that being, rather than seeking to eliminate it or diminish it in a way. Well, there are a variety of reasons. Now, having said that, we have to understand this, that psychologically, and I'm sure Jonathan will speak to this, is that one can act under certain psychological constraints and not have the full freedom to be a moral being, and so there is a culpability issue with the taking of one's life. But we've mentioned, and I'm not going to speak about the psychological impediments, I'll let Jonathan do that if he so wishes, but I do think that there are serious moral impediments that contribute to our justifying the taking of another life, taking our own life in that respect, and primarily that's despair. Now, oftentimes it might be the case that we want to interpret despair as a psychological condition, but in the ancients and St. Thomas Aquinas, it's not a psychological condition, it's a moral condition in which one has lost vision of the good and has formed one's character in such a way as to become, well, not virtuous, but I don't know, vicious, but at least not good.
Oh, yeah. We'll switch up the order a little bit here. Oh, yeah. Well, actually, you can go then, because I didn't have a response for those. You can start. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll sort of not address the issue of the morality of suicide. I think for reasons that have probably become sort of obvious. Obviously, working in the sciences, you're going to sort of have to address moral questions in a different light, and probably not address them at all. And so I'm assuming both of you will have more to say on that issue, and have some more on that issue. But with regards to the rationality of it, I think Dr. Marshall does bring up a very good point, especially if we look at certain therapeutic schools of psychology. And the one I'm thinking of in particular is called cognitive behavioral therapy. The general viewpoint is that humans sort of have cognitive processes within which they think and operate and interact with the world. So ways that they interpret reality, ways that they understand reality. One of the things that cognitive behavioral therapy addresses is the issue of cognitive distortions. so distortions of reality that are most likely to arise in cases of depression, various anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, things like that. So one of the difficulties with someone who is suicidal, as Dr. Marshall mentioned, is they might not be thinking in a completely rational way. One of the sort of ways of looking at it is they're usually called cognitive errors, or like certain types of errors. So for instance, a depressive person might catastrophize. A particular bad event happens and they immediately interpret it as, this is the worst thing. I'll never be able to overcome this. I'm the cause of this. So different sort of category errors that make it so that the person believes something which is not the case. And if they were to act on that, I would certainly say that that's irrational. Having said that, though, I'll just briefly conclude. Go to Professor Patel here. I think there are some rational circumstances, or rather some circumstances which are rational where suicide can be justified. This would obviously get us into an entire different discussion, but I would reference cases of particularly painful terminal illness, where I think that it would be rational to some extent to at least opt for suicide. There's a lot of complexity to that answer, because if it does depend to an extent on what happens after death. If nothing happens after death, then it might not be the most rational choice, because you're not bringing an end to the pain you're experiencing. You're just sort of ending your experience in general. But at least in those cases, I think there is greater reason to consider suicide than in cases of people who are clinically diagnosed with a particular mental illness, so depression, anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, things like that.
I can't get to a prohibition of suicide from a secular point of view. The two things that I see are what Professor Marshall first brought out of if somehow the life that we have is somebody else's possession or derives from somebody else, it's either a gift or it actually belongs to some other being, that would be a reason for it to be immoral. Which, from a secular point of view, I don't know how you get to that idea. And then secondly, the idea that we do have, this is the one that I think from a secular point of view you might find it immoral, is the relationships that you have to other people. That it wouldn't be really a special case of immorality. It would be of a piece with any kind of breach of contract or breach of responsibility, breach of duty. If you have children, if you have people who depend on you, you've got people who love you, then the question of opting out, just like any other kind of opting out, I don't know that it presents a specialer problem that it sort of ought to for the drama of it.
I'm afraid that biology really doesn't have much to say about the morality or the rationality of suicide. I will say that it is shown sometimes that suicide can be evolutionarily advantageous if the parent has already birthed offspring or already reproduced. Then it is advantageous at that point for the parent to be removed from the system. Sometimes, obviously, not every, but if there's a drain on resources that could otherwise be avoided, that would benefit the offspring, then it can be an adaptive trait that at some point the parents refuse to eat or in some other way lead themselves to being killed or to die. This is also disturbingly shown in some statistics of elderly people, that the elderly have a much higher rate of suicide than younger populations do. Possibly for this reason, I won't speak too much about the psychology of it because I just don't know. But I do know that those statistics do correspond to the ideas in biology there is sometimes an urge that is inborn due to evolution to benefit offspring by removing themselves from being a drain on the resources of that offspring.
Thank you.
I have questions.
Yes, go right ahead.
I've got all kinds of questions. I'm sorry, your name again?
St. John.
St. John. So, my dad's almost 86 years old. Is he violating his biological imperative to stop eating and leap off a cliff into the world of lemmings or something? I mean, I'm serious about that, but I'm asking it facetiously.
No, I understand. I would say that as human beings, we are moral, and we don't, just because something might seem evolutionarily advanced. That's why I didn't really want to speak on the moral point, because just because it might seem adaptive for animals doesn't mean it's proper behavior for humans. And it reminds me of, in Origin of the Species, what Darwin says about like eliminating less fit individuals in order to benefit the species over the long term, where he says that we just wouldn't do that, even if we recognize that it is beneficial, because we care about those people and we love them, and it's inhuman to do so. So I as to the question of whether he's violating some kind of evolutionarily driven advantage or action, I can't say for certain, because those ideas aren't proven completely. But as for whether he's doing something immoral by staying alive, I would say emphatically, no, he is not.
Well, of course, it was a question of determinism. You know, are these evolutionary imperatives something that determine us to where we have to abide by them? But then the related question to this is, when we're observing animals, for example, who stop eating or whatever the case may be, how do we know that they're committing suicide?
That's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't have a sufficient answer for it.
I don't have a response to the second question, but I guess one thing, and maybe, I don't know if someone can back me up on this biologically speaking, but it does seem like there is a difficulty discussing evolutionary theory in terms of imperatives. And the only reason I say that is because an imperative to me implies a sort of normativity, like what you ought to do in a particular circumstance. Every time it's you. And I don't think that evolutionary theory necessarily speaks in terms of normativity. I don't know if any scientific theory can. And so I think that it might be more fair. I guess the question to me almost, it seems like unintentionally loaded to an extent, because evolution sort of makes more sense to me as a description of, these confluence of forces over time, natural selection and the environment and things like that, such that you couldn't really say that one thing is an imperative. You could merely say that it tends to correlate with an increased chance of survival or something like that. So if that, I guess, makes sense. If that's just
Yeah. Actually, that does make a lot of sense, because it's not as though these animals or people are driven to suicide by the thought that they should do it. Like they don't think it's moral for me to do this for my children. It's just that it's possible that in some species their survival has been benefited by this. So those that do feel the urges to do this have survived into the future, and so they're inborn.
It's still a matter of difficult to interpret that this albatross is actually committing suicide by what it's doing.
That's certainly true. They definitely wouldn't leave a note.
I think one thing that is interesting, I do think the question of animal suicide is an extremely relevant one, because there's a massive difference between human beings and animals. For instance, our capacity for language, like St. said at the end, an animal can't leave a note. But I think, all joking aside, that is a serious point. Another issue, though, I think it has less to do with our capacity for language and more to do with what's probably the underlying component behind our capacity for language, which is our higher cognitive ability. And I think that probably, to some extent, has something to do with our sort of tendencies toward suicide. And so I think there is probably a difference between animals and human beings, and it's probably higher level cognitive processes, sort of owing to the complexity of the
next question has slightly been touched on, and it is how should death affect the way we live?
I think it's interesting to think about what happens to meaning if there's an end to what we have. And so in two different fields, what happens to truth if not only you die, but eventually the human race goes extinct, so that ultimately there's nobody in whom to deposit all the culture, the discoveries, everything, all the talk that we've done through history. Somehow the idea that everything at some point is going to pass, I think that's just kind of an expanded version of the problem of your own personal immortality, or the question of it. If it is the case that ultimately for the human race, there's going to be nothing, no trace, it seems to me it undoes meaning. It possibly undoes truth. And I wonder also what it does to moral problems. That if you make someone suffer, and if a lot of people have suffered over the course of human history, and then finally there's going to be no one to feel that anybody has ever suffered. Does it matter that they suffered? Just because they felt pain at that time, it's over. It's over. Did it have any ultimate meaning to it? I think it's odd that somehow meaning entails this contextualization, that somehow without a surrounding context, which is, in a